Yes, hello, welcome everyone. This is Daniel Dipple with Passageways, and very glad to bring everyone here for a board and management succession planning, best practices for sustainable success. We have Stuart R. Levine, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with from some of our great past webinars, and we also have a special guest, Dennis Whalen from Passageways. And if you could go to Stuart's bio here, I want to quickly talk about Stuart. And right before we jump into that, a little housekeeping. During the webinar, you'll see several in-webinar polls will come up, and we appreciate if everyone could promptly, answer those so we can get some nice little bit of data we can share with each other here live online. And then also at the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. We'd appreciate it if everyone would take a little time to fill that out. All right, so getting on to Stuart R. Levine. He's the chairman and CEO of Stuart Levine Associates, our management consulting firm, and also chairman and CEO of EduLeaders, an online digital learning company. Stuart has a tremendous amount of board experience, and he, as you can see in his bio, there's an ACD governance fellow, and twice awarded a top 100 director, and also he's a best-selling author of 3 leadership books, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Stuart, I'll hand it off to you, and you can do a nice warm welcome to Dennis.
Okay, well, thank you, Daniel, and thanks to Passageways for hosting us today. So Dennis Whalen is the leader of the KPMG Board Leadership Center. He spent quite a bit of his life dedicated to, I'll call it, intelligent board leadership and ensuring, I will call it, shareholder success. He was named as one of the most influential people in governance by Directorship magazine, as well as being a fellow NACD board leadership person, and served on a number of blue ribbon commissions. So Dennis, thank you so much for joining us today. And I know that our participants will benefit greatly from your insights and experiences. And let me move ahead on to the next slide. And basically, 2 very important issues for those of us, Dennis and myself, that look at where organizations are going. And we talk about board and management succession planning, and they are serious issues with serious consequences. And one housekeeping note, we will also encourage our participants to share questions for Dennis and myself, and we are committed to answering those questions. So you can just type in on the appropriate part of the portal anything that's on your mind, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions, and I would encourage you to do them sooner than later. Seems to me that when we talk about succession, whether it's for the CEO, management team, or a board, there are serious responsibilities. And I want to just, I'll call it, set the platform for the conversation with an experience I had at a board dinner one night, and we were considering 2 candidates for succession, candidate A and candidate B. And most of us had interviewed both candidates. The chairman of the board turned to me and said, Stuart, you met both of those people. What did you think, and what's your recommendation from your point of view? And I said, I'd be delighted to answer that, but I think what would be most helpful for the conversation is somebody please just tell me where you believe this company will be in 5 years. How will it be defined by products and services for its particular customer/client base? And that will inform my decision. And I share that example because what we as directors or management people need to do is really understand where we're going, because that informs who we try to attract to our boards and how and who we develop to become our most senior leaders. So the next slide has our first poll question, which is, do you have a detailed board succession plan that has been implemented? Option 1, yes. Yes, but not sufficient. No, but discussing or on the agenda. Or lastly, no. So I'd encourage everybody who's with us just to click on. And then, Dennis, I would say to you, where do you think our participants will come out on this question?
Well, Stuart, thanks for the introduction, and to those on the call today, happy to be here. Looking forward to the conversation and particularly the questions that come in from the field. We just did a survey of 2,300 directors asking a number of questions, including this one. The results of that survey, so that'll be good test for our survey, came out that said 14% of the directors in that group of 2,300 believed that they had a detailed board succession plan. So I guess we'll see, Stuart.
That's really interesting, and that's the KPMG survey, I guess, huh? So
Correct.
Let's see what our participants said, Dennis. So here we are. Well, Dennis, that's pretty interesting. 12% said yes, 15% yes, but not sufficient, no, but discussing, and so forth. So how do you relate that to your most current detailed responses, Dennis?
It looks pretty close, right? The 12 and 15% probably lines up very nicely with our 14%. And the interesting thing, Stuart, our survey was a global survey, and we really didn't see, we could cut the data various ways, US, Europe, UK, Asia. There really weren't dramatic differences in the answer to the question, at least across the developed, countries that we surveyed. So herein lies the challenge. One of the things we'll talk about is with that 12 and 15% here, another data point from our survey, 77% of the directors said if they had a detailed succession plan that they were executing against, that would be a great way to make sure that they manage succession appropriately and continue to keep the composition of board fresh and relevant for the company that they're overseeing.
Dennis, what I find most interesting, and I almost said jarring, about your data and the data we just got from people with us today, is if you go to any of the NECD workshops or things that you and myself do pretty regularly, everybody always talks about our two primary focuses. One, as directors, development of strategy, affirmation of that, and secondly, succession planning. So that data really shows quite a gap opportunity. So Dennis, why don't you begin our conversation and talk to us about boards and the challenges that you see?
Great, happy to. So we have a scenario where people think a plan is good to have, but not a lot of people have plans. And when you sit back and reflect on that, you kind of say, well, why is that? The reason, or the simple reason, it's hard. And it's hard for a bunch of different reasons. One of the reasons is they needing to align the composition of the board with the strategy of the company. And boards, particularly over the last 3 to 5 years, are really spending a lot more time involved in strategy. It's one of the top 2 priorities, with the other one being CEO succession, which we'll talk about later. But there's a ton of barriers that get in the way of doing what seems to be simple. One might be just prioritizing it, but you just look at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. There's always a wealth of examples of boards that find themselves in the crosshairs. So the boards tend to be dealing with a lot of issues, whether it's changes in the business, disruptors coming in to attack the companies, could be activists, could be regulations, it could be globalization, could be just management turnover and things of that nature. But the simple question is, if a company is changing as much as it is, how can the board's composition kind of not have that level of change? And so the biggest question that I think boards have to come to grips with is, just because the 10 or 11 directors that we elected 10 years ago were fabulous directors then, how do you make sure that the right directors for the company today, and equally important, the right companies or the right directors for the company 3 to 4 years out? I mean, Stuart, your opening comment was, with the scenario of Director A and Director B, what does the company look like in a couple of years? That's really critical to answering that question. And I think looking back 5 or 10 years ago, that was probably not as important a question as it is today. And I think people are trying to get comfortable with a world that's moving faster than it has before, and needing to think about board composition in a scenario where there's not a whole lot of turnover in the directors' roles across most companies. And one of the parts that drives right into that scenario is there is a very real stigma to people rotating off of boards, because if you look historically, most of the times when people come off of boards, it's not because the company has changed directions. And so I think there's a unwritten rule that if you come off of a board and it's not because there was an age limit or a term limit, it's because you did something wrong. And I think that's probably the single most important thing that I think boards and directors are going to have to come to deal with. And I think that we should be able to find ourselves in a scenario that lets people say, I was the right director and I did a great job for the 5 or 10 or 15 years I was on the board, but this company is a different company than I'm comfortable with, and it's time for me to move on so somebody with the right set of skills can come in. So let's go to the next slide, and we've got a couple of additional data points from that survey that I mentioned earlier, and I'll draw your attention to the first question and the last question, because the first question says what are the biggest challenges or concerns, and the last question says, okay, what would be the most effective mechanism to get the right blend of skills and backgrounds and experiences. And the challenge and concern is aligning board talent with the company's 3 to 5 year strategy. So that's what everybody's worried about. And the answer, or what would be deemed to be the most effective mechanism, is to get that alignment right. But that's probably the hardest part, and that's why there's the challenge exacerbated to some degree by lack of turnover, but that inability across a large population of companies, not all companies, some do a great job at this, but not enough, I guess, is the question. Where are we going? What's it look like in 3 to 5 years? And how do we make sure we get the right skills for that company going forward? And I mentioned earlier, an average board has 10 or 11 directors on it, but turnover on that average board, it's probably 1 director every 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 years. So turnover in the directors on a particular board, it doesn't happen regularly. So that's part of the reason why there's not a detailed plan, there's not an effective process, because the directors haven't had to deal with it that often. And as I said before, that stigma of people coming off, that's part of the problem that we've got to get our minds around and got to figure a more effective way of dealing with that. And then that question in the middle, I think, is an interesting one too. Everybody talks about skill matrices when they're looking at the composition of a board. They do add some different, skills to that matrix to make it fresh. Cyber technology. Those are 2 of the hot topics that people talk about. But I found it really interesting that 69% of the directors in our survey said that the greatest barrier to getting that high-performing board was finding a director with not only general business experience, but the specific experience that they're looking for when they're trying to fill that hole that they may have in the composition of the board with one individual. And, there's lots of dialogue and conversations going around. Do I hire somebody just for X? And let's say X is cyber, because that's been a hot topic. The question is, yes, you may need a cyber expert on the board, but maybe you don't need to have that. The cyber expert doesn't have to be a director. Maybe it can be an advisor to the board. So I think it's really interesting that 69% of the directors said we really want people that are generally business astute, good skills, leadership skills, people skills, so that they really have a seat at the table for all of the issues that they need to deal with. And if they have a major in a particular thing that we find useful, that would be great. But the inability to find both seems to be one of the challenges. And I think part of that, the last comment I'll make on this slide, part of that I think is there still is a tendency to say, I don't want to bring onto my public company board particularly a new director who's never been a director on a public company board. So that in and of itself, I think, is another constraint to finding the right talent who has that blend of good business skills and experiences in your in particular industry the company's operating on, or the geographies that are important to it, and that deep technical knowledge on one particular thing that is relevant to the board skills. So, Stuart, I don't know if there are any questions are coming in, or we just want to move to the next slide, but those were the points I wanted to make to tee us up.
Yeah, Dennis, you used the word predictability, and where we sit today as business colleagues, if you think about the disruptive forces in competition vis-a-vis new emerging and evolving technology, blowing away the original premise of Moore's law, looking at, I'll call it economic, global, as well as domestic volatility, demographic shifts, because when eventually we talk later on this afternoon about demographic shifts, diversity, you start to see that cyber threats, the complexity is really taking the word predictability that you spoke about as almost an ancient byword, if you will, Dennis. That's what struck me when I heard you use that word in, I'll call it a very constructive conversation,
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So go ahead, Dennis, fire away.
Yeah, the people are looking for predictability, but we're living in a world of dramatic uncertainty, whether it's geopolitics across the globe or just look at our own country with the situation in Washington going on, and how do you run a company and how do you serve on a board in this environment? And I think the answer is you've got to think about a lot of things. You've got to be doing a lot of scenario planning for the ones that are really critical to the success and the continuance of the company. And you've got to be willing to rethink everything you did yesterday, tomorrow, when the world shifts under your feet.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to poll question 2, which ties into our conversation. And the question is, why do you think succession planning efforts may not be optimal? Board members push back, not enough time allocated on board agendas, not enough focus on 3 to 5 year out planning, and not sure. So Dennis, what's your best 15 seconds on this question?
Yeah, Stuart, I think this one's going to be all over the lot. I think those are all real good reasons. The way I think about it, one is I don't think it becomes a priority to absolutely has to. When somebody's ready to retire, then it gets really serious. But the other part is I think it's hard, right? Because directors on a particular board have been working together with each other for a long period of time, and some don't like having another director come into that mix to disrupt the chemistry, the camaraderie, or the experiences that they've enjoyed and worked through over the years. So let's see what the data shows.
Yeah, let's see what the data says, Daniel. Can you put that up on the screen? So here we go. Board member pushback 15%, not enough time, not enough focus on the plan, and just plain old not sure. Any fast responses to that, Dennis?
Yeah, no, the 3 to 4 year out being the highest one, that's part of the issue, right? Because knowing what a company's even going to look like 3 to 5 years out, that's kind of tough in today's environment. So, but it seems like the other ones are kind of spread around pretty evenly.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Dennis. And basically, here we're going to talk about the challenge of board succession. And a number of years ago, I was lead director of a very large healthcare NASDAQ company. And we actually had not done a good enough job on succession planning, which brought me to a conclusion that we needed to pursue a major acquisition to acquire talent at the C-suite level that would ensure stability in our company's life. And the action actually, we brought the company out at $6, and 10 years later we're at $26. But the point is, there are serious consequences to succession planning, and asking the questions about, based on criteria, what should we be looking at? And part of that is culture on the board. And I think when we talk about what's the best process, the most interesting thing from our point of view is the assessment, because the board assessment really effectively is the equivalent of every morning as you prepare to go out to your professional responsibilities. You look in the mirror, and some days I have a good hair day and some days I don't. And a board assessment driven by an independent organization is the equivalent of holding up that mirror and saying, hey, here's kind of what we say about ourselves, and here is what the culture looks like on our board. And that data, I believe, and our experience dictates to us, that begins the baseline for an intelligent conversation. And when we talk about the assessment is not only of the board, but it's also of the CEO. And one of the key criteria, whether in fact on our work today, we see a cross-section of people from credit unions, health systems, for-profit publicly traded corporations. But in my view, if your board doesn't have the vibrancy to understand the investment of technology, which has implications for cyber and learning, then I'm not so sure that our board has the appropriate leverageability and intellectual curiosity to really move things forward. And when we talk about that assessment, we're involved in one right now where not only do you include the CEO in the board assessment, but we're running a parallel track in gathering information about the succession planning from the management team to see what that relationship looks like in an effective relationship that is accretive. And I think lastly on this slide, what we're sharing with you is experience, and it is not one size fits all. I would observe that the issues that Dennis put in place so well on succession planning for a board really should be evolutionary and not revolutionary, so that you, unless there is a reason to blow up the board, and periodically you will see where the board has turned let's call it a deaf ear to a bad culture, a questionable culture, but in general, planning makes it evolutionary, and I think it gets you through, I'll call it, Dennis, the issues that you were talking about vis-a-vis somebody's on for 10 years, 12 years. At what point do they become an insider, and making sure that directors are engaged in some type of conversation that ensures adding value and currency. The next slide talks about how we do that assessment and ensure that everybody's engaged, because in today's world where we all understand the not only complexity, but I will call it the intensity of change, if you have a board of 10 or 11 people, it's very difficult to move with the type of clarity if you have 3 or 4 people on that board who are viewing the world in a context that's a decade or 2 old. If you're not current with technology, if you're not current with the demographic and diverse changes in the marketplace, it's awfully difficult to serve, I'll call it, customers and clients who are viewing the relationship in a completely different space. And last night I had dinner with a colleague of mine, served on a board of a family business. And again, independent directors have a role even in a family-owned business, because there they become the arbiter of 2 sides of a family, which hopefully can ensure longer-term growth for the family and respect for the assets underway. And lastly, when we talk about the assessment process, I think that the role of the Chief Human Resource Officer has to be brought forward. For many years, that Chief Human Resource Officer was in a particular pigeonhole place. But today, that leader has to participate really in the most trusting, sensitive way. So when the board says, gee whiz, how are we doing with the development of our NEOs and our CEO, that we get an intelligent response. And then lastly, that there be rotation on committees. I think it's a problem when the leadership of those committees don't rotate in an intelligent way. And so succession planning comes home to roost even on the board. So let's go to poll question number 3. The question is, how do you handle underperforming directors, lead director mentoring, independent third party forms evaluation process, no follow-up from the annual assessment, people are too soft on grading other directors, or just plain old never gets addressed. Dennis, how do you think our colleagues are going to respond to this one?
I bet people are too soft will probably get a large population of the group. But you know, this is the hardest part. You know, the story I always like to tell people is when I'm talking to directors, they all know a director, at least one, who's underperforming, right, but they always say it's not somebody on their board. So it's always an interesting scenario.
I would say.
The annual self-assessments, I think most of them are on a 1 to 5 scale, with 5 being the best, and most people are somewhere around 4.5. So I don't know if that's effective anymore. It might have been a good tool a number of years ago. It just doesn't seem to be really differentiating the directors that are making an impact and the directors that aren't.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as you look at the independent assessment of the board, Dennis, I think one of the interesting ways to get to what you're talking about, which is contributions in a more granular way, is also asking the senior leadership team what type of assets would be helpful to challenge their strategic thinking as well. So let's see what our participants have to say about this question. Okay, lead director should mentor 13%, independent 5%. People are too soft on grading and it never gets addressed. So that's probably, Dennis, what you were advocating there. 82% of the people just basically say we're either too soft or it never gets addressed because it is, frankly, too personal with too many consequences. But you and I know long term, if in fact we as directors are going to be charged with the responsibility of identifying succession CEO, and we got to have some really good people who are on speed, who understand where the world's going, that can participate in those conversations. So let's move to the next slide, driving progress with simple steps. And Dennis, you want to take that, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stuart. You know, this is summarizing what I mentioned before. 77% of our respondents said a formal plan would be great, or at least one of the 2 most effective mechanisms, but only 14% had it. And so thought we'd share some points that maybe will help get that 40% up closer to the 77. The way I think about it is the governance committee, it's their responsibility. And I would make sure the governance committee, just like other committees, have rolling agendas. You know, I've chaired the KPMG audit committee for a number of years, and we had what I thought was appropriate. It was an 18-month rolling agenda. So over the course of 18 months, we got everything in that we needed to get in. Maybe if you're the chair of a governance committee, you need to have a rolling, you know, 3-year agenda so you get succession more front and center when you're not having turnover every year. Because I think part of the challenge is as simple as saying, you know, it's out of sight, out of mind, because I don't have to prepare to get a new director on board because Johnny or Sally's not retiring for another 3 or 4 years. So a simple step like getting the chair of the governance committee to build a plan that makes sense, to think about where the company's going strategically and where you know, the director turnover might be on a 3 to 5 year horizon. so that you can wind up with, the right pool of talent, so you can bring in diversity in the boardroom, whether you define the diversity to be gender or ethnicity or geography or industry or the types of experience. I think every board's got to face that themselves. But if, Stuart, you talked about looking in the mirror, whether you'd have a bad hair day. If you're bored and you're looking in the mirror as a board and you all look alike, you're probably leaving something on the table in terms of serving the shareholders that you are responsible to. So figuring out how you can take a longer term view, understand where the company's going, and honestly take a look at that skills assessment and say, what do we really need to bring into the mix? Do we see big M&A in the company's future? And if we do, should we go get somebody who's really, really deep in M&A? Appreciating that comment I made earlier that you still need that broad business skills, those people skills, so you can be effective across all of the issues that the board's going to face. And another tool that I've seen used pretty appropriately is, there's nothing wrong with adding 1 or even 2 slots to a board, so that when Johnny or Sally, I used their names before, are retiring 3 or 4 or 5 years out, it would be nice to have a couple directors who have been, on the board a year or 2 before Johnny and Sally bid farewell. So one of the tricks or tools that people use is just flexing the size of the board. If it's 10 today, make it 12 for a discrete period of time so you can get that transition on and bring the right skills. And once you have the turnover that you're expecting, you can bring it right back to the 10. I think another part that I see a lot of boards really starting to evolve to, which feels like it makes a lot of sense, Stuart, is to think about tenure on the board such that and I'll use round numbers, a third of the directors have been around for 10 years. And that experience is worth its weight in gold if the person is still fully engaged as many directors or maybe most directors are today. But, a third of the directors have been around for 10 years. A third are in that growing but contributing 5 to 10 year batch. And the last third are some newer directors that are in that 0 to 5 years. So we're seeing a lot of companies starting to think about, as they're trying to change composition and blending all these competing forces together, thinking about, the tenure of the groups and making sure they're fit for purpose with the skills that they need, the historical experiences, the relationships, but also understanding, what's happening in business, because they were just a CEO of a company and they just retired from that role, as opposed to being a CEO who retired 15 years ago, because the world is changing. So that mix of life on the board, I think, is a neat way to kind of to get that progress and get the diversity into the boardroom. And you look at there's survey after survey that says the more you can bring people into the room that think differently, the stronger the board will be, and the better oversight it will be of management, and more helpful in setting strategy, evaluating strategy, and monitoring execution against the strategy on behalf of the shareholders.
Thanks, Dan. And let's go to the raising the bar, Dennis, on board succession. Keep that part of the conversation going, please.
Yeah, this one, this is kind of my takeaway slide for the participants. I think it's really critical to create turnover on a board, and I think you need to do it thoughtfully, and you got to be careful. Just because somebody's turning 72 doesn't mean they're not the best director on your board. So you've got to really be thoughtful. And the term that I've used the term that I've heard some people use that really hones in on it for me is what you're looking for is not someone of a particular age, but somebody who's every ounce of their body equates to what people characterize as lifelong learners. You know, I was associated with a Fortune 10 company a couple of years back, and the lead director hit the retirement age that that company had, and a number of Fortune 100 companies have retirement ages. They're usually 72 or 75, and so at 72, he had to, you know, rotate off the board. He was absolutely the best director I've seen in the last 15 years. So, you know, age limits, tenure, those are tools, but you've got to be careful whether you're, you know, you don't never want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and you've got to be very thoughtful. But the characteristic that I think is critical to a successful director is someone who's a lifelong learner, because that will serve you well 3 months from now, 3 years from now, and 10 years from now. And then the skills matrix is another really important thing. You talked about it, Stuart, but you've got to be really careful, because the human nature in us is when somebody says, here's 12 important criteria for being on our board, you got to avoid checking all 12 boxes or 11 of the 12. And what you need to reflect on as director is, what do I bring to the table that's different than somebody else? And not just try to say, yeah, I got that, and I got this, and I've got that, and really hone in on what your contribution is. Because if you understand what that is, and the other directors understand what that is, you know, if it changes, and that's no longer something that's important, then you might be the director who it's time to say, I've enjoyed my 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. I'm going to go serve on another board where this criteria is needed more than it is on this company. So that's really the message from this one. And I think it's just a matter of focus. It's a matter of getting it the right attention. You know, it wasn't too long ago that directors were saying we're not spending enough time in strategy, and strategy became front and center now on most boards, and it's because it was built into the process. It was built into the agenda. It was built into the DNA of the board, and it just became we've got that one in good shape. We'll continue to focus on strategy. I think succession is just one of those ones. With the importance of the composition of the board, I think just getting it into the DNA and the process all the time, just like the CEO is talking about succession on his team, it's important that it's front and center within the director succession planning. And I think if you do some of those simple steps, I think the composition of boards will continue to improve, and board service will be the role that we all want it to be in the governance community and the director community, and it will serve us well with the bumps and turns that we're inevitably going to see in the months and years to come.
Thanks, Dennis. We'll go to poll number 4, which is, do you have a formal succession in place for your CEO? Yes. Yes, but not sufficient? No. But discussing, put it on the agenda? Flat out, no. Dennis, what's your sense of where people are thinking about?
This is a really hard one, Stuart. I think if the CEO succession is near term, and I'll say 2 to 3 years, I bet we'll get people would have formal ones. But if your CEO just joined 2 years ago, I suspect there's not a lot of focus on it today.
Okay, so let's see what our participants have to say about this question. So here we are. They do, 43%. This is a very informed group. Yes, but not sufficient, 18. Discussing it, 15, and flat out no, 23%. So Dennis, any fast reactions to this data?
I'd say that's impressive. I don't think I've seen 43% in this kind of question in other surveys. So this is a really impressive group, Stuart.
Well, I'll tell you why it's impressive, and this kind of is serious in my mind. Everybody who's on this call today is expressing something that we really respect, and that is learning. And so people at their free will are coming in, spending an hour or so thinking about some tough issues. And so the people that are on this, in participating in this little conversation today are thinking about some tough issues. So I think that might explain the high number, Dennis, that you see on this question. So let's go to the next page and talk about the challenge of CEO planning, and understand one of the things that we as directors can do is to start to, as we evaluate that CEO every year, that the board ensures the CEO is building a talent-rich organization by attracting and developing the right people. From my vantage point, that's a really important issue. Aside from, let's call it, benchmarking your success at the end of the year and talking about EPS, I think it's as important and something that gives us a longer view is what type of talent, what is the diversity of that talent, and seeing the metrics, what's the employee satisfaction look at, and by the way, do we as directors meet with people, not just the C-suite, but do we go out and have a cup of coffee with that, let's call it CFO, CIO, and meet his or her next bandwidth of talent. And I think that starts to stimulate a succession strategy that feels a little collaborative and less punitive, but that's a way of, I'll call it, stimulating internal development. But from my vantage point as a director, I always like to see that on the CEO's dashboard. So it's something that we can get metrics at the end of the year on the development of, let's call it, the next level or two throughout the organization that gives us a better sense, because we know, I'll call it, homegrown tomatoes are better than ones you buy in a store. And so that becomes part of the board culture because it is a direct reflection, but it also, I think, with the data, again, gives us the character to have those ongoing direct conversations and, by the way, ensure that other people who attend are not necessarily the named executive officers, but they are people that are so critical to our organization's success going forward. The next slide talks about the 5 strategic drivers, and clearly in our mind, number one, understanding demographic trends. Because if in fact we don't understand demographic trends, it's really tough for us to recruit and use, I will call it, our talent as a strategic weapon. Understanding as a board the technology shifts that are so dramatic. And I think, and Dennis, before we got on, we were talking about Washington, and some people are making the mistake that to think that there will be no more national government oversight, which I think is a huge error. I think monitoring that becomes important, and also saying that we have to acknowledge the time that directors are responsible for, I'll call it, engaging with the CEO and his or her team and moving that forward. Next slide talks about succession planning. 56% of people talk about it's a critical gap. And an interesting piece of data, Dennis, is we now see culture linking into this, and 85% of CEOs are telling us they're not sure that they have the appropriate culture to support a new strategic direction. And so asking the culture to tell us what that looks and feels like, I think, becomes important. And utilizing directors to mentor and develop talent, particularly diverse candidates, I think is a huge opportunity for all of us to take a look at. And then lastly, because we were talking about, let's call it, the validity of the assessment process. So what we see, which is a little different, Dennis, and I want to get you thinking on this, and I've been on 10 boards in my career, and some of the boards would take the annual assessment, some of it generated internally themselves, others even through a third party. You would distribute the, call it, assessment report, and there would be no conversation. We're involved in a large organization today, publicly traded corporation, where we'll do the assessment, and then present it in a 2-hour session, 2.5-hour session in Europe with their board to say, hey, here's what the data, and by the way, here are some of those anecdotal responses, and you get a conversation going, because often people don't spend enough time. You invest in the process, if you will, but then having a discussion, and I'll call it a very trusting way, and it, I think, helps strengthen the culture of a corporation or a board. If you have an honest discussion of, and by the way, here, and it helps if it's presented by an independent party, here are some of the more granular comments that we heard, and you watch people's eyes, and then that will give people permission, and it stimulates a discussion that becomes pretty substantive. Dennis, how do you respond to that? You know, and the gravity of the assessment process, so it's not just what you and I call a check the box exercise.
Yeah, Stuart, I think that's what better practice has evolved to. Having somebody from the outside come in, do interviews of each and every director, do interviews with the C-suite and perhaps others if they play an integral role between management and the board, and then taking that information, you know, a 360 look at the board effectiveness, and playing it back with the directors in a room. Obviously, you'd be doing it in a constructive fashion, but I think having an outsider run the process, I think the things that don't get said in a self-assessment, in the spirit of collegiality, are the things that come out. And I think as they come out, directors will realize, you know, maybe I need to step up my game, or maybe my days are numbered here and I ought to go do something else. All directors, even if they rotate off the board, are generally successful folks in multiple careers over their life. And so sometimes you just don't realize how other people think of you. And over time, that view changes. And it's nice to have real data. You know, if somebody tells me what I'm doing well and what I could improve on, I can, you know, make sure I continue to do the things that I do well and reflect on the things that are opportunities of improvement, then I can drive change. And if you don't get that true and honest feedback, whether you're a director or a CEO, you're going to be blinded by it. And I think it's the wave of the future, Stuart.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I think honest self-assessments are a definition of character. And, you know, it's important that we have those discussions. Hey, Daniel, I want to look to you as to questions that may have come in from our participants, and let you ask Dennis and or myself any of those that you're capturing.
Yeah, let's see here real quick. First question. So for CEO succession, what traits, experience, and background do you feel make a good candidate to groom for CEO?
Well, I'll just give you a couple, and then I'll swing it over to Dennis. For me, there are two things that I look at. Number one, I want to make sure that candidate, if you will, has achieved some definable success, financial or organizational, products and services, number one. And number two, I always ask the question of the candidate, tell me about the team you've developed, because that tells me if they're threatened by a succession planning conversation, and how, I'll call it, open they are to developing talent in the organization. And then I guess lastly, reputational risk, because for us as directors, that's a huge issue. So values and how they've lived their lives become important to me. Dennis, any thoughts on Daniel's question?
Yeah, I've got a couple that are similar, Stuart. I look for leadership. And when I say leadership, I want somebody who, when they walk into the room, people notice, but also somebody who's a team builder, who is always working hard to get the best out of the team, and avoiding surrounding him or herself with yes folks. But I also want a strategic thinker, right? It's really important that you've got somebody who's comfortable thinking strategically, thinking about shifting a business that's profitable today ahead of the curve. If that business doesn't have a future forever because of shifts in technology or other disruptors. And also, obviously, I think you want somebody who's got a proven track record. And your point too, Stuart, integrity is absolutely critical in leaders today. They have to have a moral compass that can't shake no matter the size of the tremor around them and their companies.
Yeah. Dennis, that is so important because every corporation I've ever interfaced with, or I bet both of us, I'll call it every year or two, there's a little speed bump out there. And you always want people to be able to be direct, be honest, acknowledge whatever, let's call it the error was, and then move on. And you only get in trouble in life, I think, when you go into a sense of denial, And so that character issue, and that speaks, Dennis, to, let's call it the referral basis, right? How many times during the year do you get referral questions from, I'll call it, clients, past clients that you've interfaced with to ask about those questions? Do you have any experience in that?
Well, you get those all the time, and they come, and sometimes you don't even know what the question is, and you figure it out a day or so later when you reflect on the conversation you had.
Really? Yeah. I mean, that's what social media, and that's what relationships are all about. There is no hiding anymore, right? So the referral basis from a very experienced fellow like yourself and your great organization becomes important because guess what? You live with those executives every day, and you're seeing how they respond to, let's call it, a deficiency that one of your team may have figured out or something like that. And that's critical to this calculus, I think.
Stuart, if I reflect on my career, some of the biggest learnings I've had have come from those snafus when something went wrong. It's how do you deal with it? How do you rally around it? How do you learn from it? And how do you make sure it never gets repeated? 100%. And a lot of people probably have that same perspective.
Sure. So Daniel, you have another question from our group?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. Quick reply. Let's see. When speaking of outside evaluations, do you include the executive team in the evaluation of the directors?
I think that might be a new trend. I think it's healthy. I think there's two paths. One, again, remember what we said. It's not one size fits all, but a learned group, in my opinion, you take the board data that you collect from the board, and then on a parallel track, you ask the senior leadership how the board can serve that corporation even more effectively. And what does that interface look like, and what information and so forth. And then I think you start to get to a really honest discussion if you share that without attribution, very important, because you don't want to cost somebody their career because of this. It's got to be through a trusted, let's call it, party. But then the board members get a better sense of, gee whiz, here's how I can really help that company. Dennis, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I guess the word that I'd use, Stuart, is it's important to keep the balance right. You're evaluating the effectiveness of the board, and so what each director thinks is really, really important. But I think it's also very important for a handful of the executives in the C-suite to share their perspective on the board, because, if a board says do this, I promise you, most, if not all, companies will do it, no matter how much time it takes. And sometimes directors don't understand the cause and effect of sometimes what they think are simple questions. So getting that feedback, getting that insights, I think is valuable in terms of, making sure you're working together effectively.
And you know what, Dennis, you stimulated a thought in my mind. In the case that I'm referencing where a firm's involved right now, when we seek the opinions of the leadership team, it's transparent in the sense we tell the board what we're going to do. We're not saying this is what Dennis said or Stuart said or so forth, but you're being transparent so that they understand it's collaborative in nature, you know?
Yep, absolutely. It's critical.
So, Daniel, I know we're moving along, so we'll throw it back to you.
Yes, thank you, Stuart. If anyone would like to contact Dennis or Stuart, you can see on the slides here, which we will be sending out the entire presentation with all the slides to everyone after the webinar. It will be tomorrow. You'll get those in the mail, and also with a link to a recording of the webinar, so everyone will be able to partake in that. And since we are running out of time, we want to honor the fact that we'll keep you, get you out of here by 3 o'clock. I'd just like to thank Dennis and Stuart so much for coming on today. I thought it was very, very educational. And if either one of you would like to make one last little short comment, and then we'll say goodbye to everybody today.
Yeah, Stuart, I guess I'll start, and then you could wrap it up. It was fun. It was a pleasure. Succession planning is a hot topic, so doesn't surprise me that not everybody's got this hardwired, and it just takes focus and patience, and good things will happen with a thoughtful approach. And as I've seen, my experiences as directors think about what they need to focus on, they always make sure they get it done and get it done in the right way. So I think there's great opportunities for improvement with a little bit of extra focus on it.
Thanks, Dennis. And I would say in closing, if anybody's interested in the data that Dennis was referring from KPMG, I'm sure he'd be happy to send it to you if you just, knock him a note, or in our case, some of the topics we've been talking about, or in the online programs on Agile Leader as well. And I'd also want to acknowledge Passageways for providing this portal.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, sir. All right, everyone have a good day.